Welcome to the Russian Revolution Phase 1, the 1905 Revolution. So, over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution. And something you should know about the Russian Revolution, there are three major phases. There's the 1905 Revolution, which goes down in Hay, 1905. And then we're also going to have the March Revolution and the November Revolution. These revolutions sometimes are referred to as the February Revolution and the October Revolution, and that all depends on which calendar you're using. Are you using the Russian one? Remember, that was 13 days behind the rest of the world. Or are you using the calendar that everybody else was? So, as we get into our first phase of revolution and we look at how those problems we spoke about are going to lead to actual action, let's talk first about the major goals of the revolution. So, the three things that the revolutionaries wanted to accomplish. So, the first thing was to change the government. An absolute monarchy with the czar at the head was not working for the Russian people. And so many people wanted to change the government so there was more power to the people. So that's going to be one of our big goals of the Russian Revolution. A second big goal of the Russian Revolution was to fix the economy. Remember that the majority of Russia's population were peasants, as seen in this middle picture right here, and they had horrible lives in poverty. Our other group that's super poor and is not doing so hot are the factory workers, which you can see in the far right picture. And so these people also need help. So the economy needs to be fixed, Russia needs to be industrialized, modernized, and there needs to be more opportunity for the lower classes. Finally, a big, huge goal of the Russian revolutionaries was rights and liberties, that the Russian people need rights. They need freedom of speech. They need freedom of press. They need equality. So, looking over to the left, our Russian wedding cake, this situation with these different tiers and all of Russia being held up by the lower class was not going to work anymore. So, once again, three major goals for our revolution: change the government, fix the economy, rights and liberties. So let's get into our 1905 revolution. And this revolution is kicked off by an event called Bloody Sunday. Now, once again, depending on what calendar you're using, you have two different dates. So this date of Sunday, January 22nd, 1905, was the date that the rest of the world was using. For Russians, it would have been Sunday, January 9th. So it's a march of 150,000 to 200,000 people to the Winter Palace. Now, the Winter Palace was the palace that the government ran from. So Nicholas hung out there a lot, and picture this as kind of the equivalent of Versailles was to France during the French Revolution. So basically, a bunch of protesters showed up, but they were peaceful. They actually were permitted by the police to do so as long as they didn't get too close to the Winter Palace itself. And they were led by a priest named Father Gapon. And he was a Russian Orthodox priest who had organized all these groups together to come and basically ask the Tsar for help. They were asking for lots of different things in this petition they wanted to present to the Tsar. They were asking for better working conditions, better pay, an 8-hour working day, an end to the Russo-Japanese War, and more representation in the government. And you will be seeing that document eventually. So you'll get to see exactly what they were asking for and how they were asking for it. So for a bigger description of these peaceful protesters, it's important to note that they were carrying banners like Love the Tsar and Nicholas's portrait. They were singing church hymns. So once again, emphasizing this was a peaceful protest and not anti-Tsar. The people were looking to talk to their Tsar. So here you can see there's a picture, an engraving of the Winter Palace. And in this one, you can see here's our group showing up to protest at the Winter Palace. So this goes badly. Basically, Nicholas's troops, the Cossacks, remember those were our specialized military troops, people from southern regions of Russia who were known for their military prowess, their skill. So these guards opened fire on the peaceful protesters. And basically, once the smoke cleared, 200 were dead and 800 were wounded. And basically, both sides changed these numbers. The Tsar's side tried to play down the numbers, while the revolutionaries claimed thousands had been killed. And so, remember that I told you these protesters who showed up at the Winter Palace, they wanted to talk to Nicholas. The kicker was Nicholas wasn't there. And that's not shocking. Remember that Nicholas didn't like conflict. He knew a protest was coming. He left and went into one of his countryside palaces. And basically, afterwards, when people start to get outraged over this event and they name it Bloody Sunday, the Tsar is refusing to accept any responsibility for what happened. Basically, he blames the protesters, and that is a major, major mistake on his part. So, in reaction to Bloody Sunday, the Russian people are outraged, and we have strikes breaking out in all the major cities in St. Petersburg, in Kiev, in Moscow, in Warsaw. It's believed that at least 500,000 Russians were involved in these strikes. Peasants attacked landlords' homes. So within the countryside, we have chaos breaking out on top of the chaos in the cities. The Tsar's uncle, the Grand Duke Sergei, was actually assassinated during this time as well. Ground transportation and the economy came to a halt as all of the workers went on strike, protesting what happened at Bloody Sunday. And then, even within the military, we have people who were rebelling against Nicholas's reign and Nicholas's reaction to what happened at Bloody Sunday. So we have a very famous ship where sailors on May 14, 1905 mutinied and began refusing orders. Also, remember we talked about how Russia is a very diverse place and we have different ethnicities such as the Finns and the Poles rebelling, wanting independence. We're seeing that this group that's been ruled over by the Russians now all of a sudden wants to break free. Now, while all of this is going on, it's also important to note that Russia and Japan were actually in the middle of peace talks to end the Russo Japanese War. And this was going down actually in New Hampshire. So, nice US history tie in here. Teddy Roosevelt sat on these and helped negotiate, basically, played a moderator between the Russians and the Japanese. And a peace agreement was reached called the Treaty of Portsmouth. And so, during this, when all of this is going on, the Russo Japanese War does come to an end. So as the people are rebelling and the people are calling for change in the government and all those kind of goals we talked about right in the beginning, we also have the creation of what's called Soviets. So the Soviets were these new representative bodies made up of members elected by the workers and the soldiers. And so basically, these people come from the peasant class. These are peasants who have been conscripted. We're not talking about generals and the aristocrats. We're talking about the lower class. And these Soviets were a way for the lower classes to start giving themselves more representation, starting to argue for changes that would benefit them. And so the Soviets could issue orders to workers, they controlled the railroads, the factories, and they could institute strikes when needed. So this was essential for giving the lower classes more of a say or more of a voice to get the Tsar to listen to them. Now, the most famous member of these Soviets, and he was a member of the St. Petersburg Soviet, because basically different cities had different Soviets, was this guy named Leon Trotsky. And he is a huge deal, and you definitely want to remember his name. So he is a very, very famous revolutionary. He's an excellent speaker. He appealed to many people, and he's a member of, once again, that St. Petersburg Soviet. Now, eventually, he's going to become a very, very famous Bolshevik. But at first, he did not support the Bolshevik Party. He actually tried to unite the two communist parties back together. He tried to bring the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks back together. Now, as we talk about him, you're going to see that he's going to be arrested a bunch of times, sent to Siberia, and that he'll spend big chunks of this time period actually not in Russia. So he'll escape to Siberia after the 1905 revolution, and so he goes to Siberia, he escapes, and then he ends up in the United States, and he'll come back during our next phase of the Russian Revolution. So he's kind of one of these characters as well, just like Lenin, who's going to constantly be arrested or be fleeing arrest. So basically, this is a horrible situation for Nicholas. So how is he going to react? So he issues a document called the October Manifesto on October 30th, hence October Manifesto. And so basically in this document, you can see how he's going to try to give people some of these goals they want. So he promised the people civil liberties. Hey, I'm going to give you rights. The trials are going to be fair. We're going to have a good legal system. I'm going to give you freedom of speech. I'm going to allow you freedom of assembly. Hey, that right to strike, you should have that. So he's giving them rights and liberties, which was one of the revolutionaries' big goals. He's also going to allow them for a change in the government. And he created a body called the Duma. And so this is a government body which basically will consult the Tsar. And basically, what it said in the October Manifesto is that no laws could be introduced without the agreement of the Duma. And so that seems like a big power that Nicholas is willing to cede to the Duma. Like, I can't make laws without their approval. In reality, Nicholas can ignore it, and we'll see that he just basically starts dismissing it and dissolving it until he gets people in there who he agrees with. But it does seem in the document like he's giving the people what they want. And so, because of that, most people are satisfied with this and they go back to work. However, our radicals, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, say, and they spoke out against it. And basically, they say, this is not enough. This is not enough change. And by the way, this is super vague. You're not being specific about what powers you're giving up, and we want to see more change. Okay. So remember, after the October Manifesto, most people go back to work, but the Bolsheviks are still criticizing Nicholas. So is Nicholas going to be true to his word? Remember, he said freedom of speech, freedom of press, all those great rights. Basically, no. Nicholas is going to show his true colors. He believes that he is an absolute monarch, and he is not cool with the Bolsheviks calling him out and criticizing him. He arrests Bolsheviks and members of the St. Petersburg Soviet. He's basically going to disband that Soviet and all other Soviets. During this time, we also have more attacks on the Jews. Basically, Nicholas labeled them as agitators, people who were rebelling against his rule. And so we have more pogroms that occur during this time as well. Trotsky was arrested and Lenin fled to Switzerland. Like I said, Trotsky eventually will end up in the United States. And so basically, the theme after this is arrest, exile, imprisonment, and repression. Basically, Nicholas isn't going to listen to anybody else. And so between the years of 1907 and 1910, you can see how our number of communists in Russia drops drastically because basically, if you were a registered communist, the government was going to arrest you. And so another famous communist from this time period that was arrested is Joseph Stalin. You can see his mugshot right there. And that's a very young picture of Stalin. We usually don't see pictures from this time period. And so he's another guy. We're going to remember his name because he's going to be a big deal later on. And remember how I told you Nicholas finally got out of the Russo-Japanese War and they had that treaty and there was peace? The reason why I mentioned that was now all of a sudden Nicholas's troops were coming back to Russia because they're no longer fighting over in Manchuria. And basically Nicholas takes that army and he uses it to put down the St. Petersburg Soviet, disbands it, crushes the strike in Moscow, and sends the troops in the countryside to bring peace and order. So once again, Nicholas really is not staying true to what he was supposed to do according to the October Manifesto. So basically, what does this all mean? That the revolution is not over, that the 1905 revolution has not brought enough change. Really, it's brought very little change, and that we're going to need another revolution, hence why we're going to have another phase and then even another phase.